Hello, everyone. Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
Lovely to see you today. Welcome to Global Issues Talk organized by Kadir University core program. I am Dr. Mine Yıldırım and I serve as the discussant of today's long-awaited talk by one of the leading feminist philosophers, prominent Marxist, radical scholar and a pioneer in critical theories of our time. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Fraser. We have over 500 people. They are already logging in and it's a long list of waitlist. So I think we will need a couple of more minutes for everyone to join. And I want to use this time to while we're waiting for this rare, really special amount of audience, while we're waiting, I want to thank once again to Nancy Fraser for accepting our invitation. And on behalf of core program, I would like to pass our sincere thanks and gratitude for being our guest today. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you. It's an immense pleasure and privilege and excitement to welcome you, Professor Nancy Fraser, who has been not only been my mentor, intellectual and political compass for years, and my dissertation advisor, luckily, but also vibrant source of political engagement, courage, and inspiration for generations of scholar, Marxist, feminist, civil rights activist, labor and union organizer. Professor Nancy Fraser is Henry A. and Louis Loeb Professor of Politics and Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. And she's renowned for decades of scholarship in Marxism, feminist theory, and politics, political theory, political economy. She's also a self-reflexive, vibrant, and supple critique of single-issue activism, identity campaigns, and liberal conceptions of justice, gendered labor regimes, and capital accumulation. Over the years, Nancy Fraser has increasingly focused on ecological Marxism, Marxist feminist praxis, crisis theories, financialized capitalism, social production, labor exploitation, and expropriation of nature. She's also a prolific writer and author of canonical books. To name the few: Unruly Practices, Scales of Justice, Redistribution or Recognition, The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born, Feminism for 99%, and just in print. And today, as the title of today's talk indicates, we will be talking about her recent work, her recent book, just in print, Cannibal Capitalism, How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It. Once again, on behalf of the core program, I would like to extend our much gratitude, Nancy. It's a truly honor. I'm truly humbled and excited, and it's an immense pleasure to have you here with us today. And before I give you the floors, I think I am too excited to say much more. I just give you the floors. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Mina, for inviting me and for this very warm and gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to see you again and to be with this whole group of people who are connected in here on Zoom. Well, as you said, I've just published a new book called Cannibal Capitalism: How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet. And I don't think I got that exactly right, but something like that, and what we can do about it. So I thought I would try to introduce the perspective that I outline in the book, which is mainly an argument to show that capitalism in general and our specific form of capitalism today is well understood as a cannibal. I thought I would try to elaborate that idea by talking about the specific experience that we've all been through of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to start by saying that we often hear, and I'm sure you've heard, that COVID has served as a kind of perverse diagnostic, meaning it lights up all the fault lines in our society, makes visible fault lines of gender and color, nation and class. That's absolutely true. And yet, I want to suggest that we do not hear enough, and we need to hear more about the social system that generates those fault lines, that underlies them, and that underlies the present crisis. We haven't heard enough about that, even though it's the same social system, I'll suggest, that has brought us the virus in the first place and is blocking our efforts even now to deal with it. So I propose, in a sense, to stop tiptoeing around, if you like, and to cut to the chase. What the pandemic actually diagnoses is the deep-seated dysfunctionality of capitalism, and indeed of the form of it that I'm going to call cannibal capitalism. Truth be told, COVID is a kind of perfect storm, or if you like, a veritable orgy of cannibal capitalist irrationality and injustice. More than anything in recent multiple contradictions, ecological, political, social, and economic. All of these contradictions are baked into a social order that incentivizes a profit-hungry class of owners and investors to devour the essential conditions of their own existence and, what's even worse, of ours. It incentivizes them to guzzle care work, to scarf up nature, eviscerate public power, to wolf down the wealth of racialized populations, and to suck dry the energy and creativity of all working people. These things, care work, nature, public power, creativity, and energy, these things are all essential preconditions of production and accumulation, as well as, we might say, of life on the planet. Capitalist society is structured in a way that virtually begs the profit makers to gobble these things up for the sake of fattening their share prices, while absolving them of any obligation to replenish what they take or to repair what they damage. The effect then is not only to leave a trail of wreckage across the globe, but also periodically to destabilize the entire jerry-built edifice of capitalist society. That's what I want to try to show here. COVID, I'm claiming, offers a textbook demonstration of these propositions. The pandemic is an orgy where all of capitalism's contradictions converge, where cannibalization of nature, care work, and political capacity of peripheral populations and working classes all merge together in a lethal binge. We cannot properly understand the pandemic without a proper understanding of capitalism, and that means an understanding of capital as a cannibal. So let me try to unpack this idea. I'll start by noting, first of all, that the word cannibalism has several meanings. The most familiar and the most concrete is the ritual eating of human flesh by a human being. I'm sure that's the first thing you think of when you hear this word. Well, that meaning, of course, is burdened by a very long racist history. The term was implied by an inverted logic to Black Africans who were on the receiving end of Euro-imperial predation. So I have to confess that I take a certain pleasure in turning the tables and invoking the term cannibalism here as a descriptor for the capitalist class, a group I want to show that feeds off of everyone else. But the term cannibalism also has a more abstract meaning, which captures a deeper truth about our society. The verb to cannibalize means, and here I'm quoting a dictionary definition, to deprive one facility or enterprise of an essential element of its functioning for the purpose of creating or sustaining another facility or enterprise. That, I want to show, is a fair approximation of the relation of capitalism's economy to the system's non-economic precincts, to the families and communities, habitats and ecosystems, state capacities and public powers, whose substance the capitalist economy consumes in order to engorge itself. But there's also a specialized astronomical meaning. A celestial object is said to cannibalize another such object when it incorporates mass from the latter through gravitational attraction. So one star or planet, right, cannibalizes another, or an asteroid or some other planetary object. Now, this I want to show is an apt characterization of the process by which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system. And there is finally the Ouroboros. That's the mythical image of a self-cannibalizing serpent that eats its own tail. And it's actually the image depicted on my book's cover. That's a fitting image, I suggest, for a system that is wired to devour the social, political, and natural basis of its own existence, which, as I said before, unfortunately, is also the basis of our existence. In any case, I'm suggesting that the cannibal metaphor offers several promising avenues for an analysis of capitalist society. It invites us to see that social system as a kind of institutionalized feeding frenzy in which the main course is us. However, the word capitalism also cries out for some clarification. Our received understandings focus much too single-mindedly on the system's official economy. They identify the core injustice of capitalist society with the exploitation of free-waged workers at the point of commodity production. And they designate the system's defining irrationality as its tendency to precipitate economic crises. Now, these identifications are not so much wrong as incomplete. Capitalist societies do indeed generate class exploitation and economic crises as a function of their structural dynamics. But they also give rise to additional injustices and irrationalities, which are equally structural and equally serious, although they fail to appear on the radar of received understandings. These extra economic defects of capitalist society are deeply implicated in the present crisis. If we hope to interpret that crisis correctly and to figure out how to overcome it, we need to develop a new expanded conception of capitalism that foregrounds not just the system's economy, but the relation of its economy to its non-economic background conditions of possibility. I want to mention 4 such non-economic conditions for the possibility of a capitalist economy. The first is social reproduction, or as many now call it, care work. What's included here are all the activities that create, socialize, nurture, sustain, and replenish the human beings who occupy positions in the economy. You can't have a capitalist economy, after all, without workers who produce commodities under the aegis of for-profit enterprises. And you can't have them without caregivers who reproduce human beings in settings external to the official economy. Care work includes gestation, birthing, nursing, feeding, bathing, socializing, educating, healing, protecting, solacing, in short, everything essential to sustaining human beings who are at once biological and social. Historically, much of this work of social reproduction has been unwaged and performed by women, often in households, but also in communities, neighborhoods, and villages, in civil society associations, in public sector agencies, and increasingly nowadays in for-profit firms, including private schools and private healthcare facilities and nursing homes. But wherever it's done, and under whatever conditions, social reproduction is an indispensable precondition for producing commodities, making profits, and accumulating capital. And yet, capital goes to very great lengths to avoid paying for care work, or failing that, to pay as little as possible for it. And that's a setup for trouble, because capitalist societies incentivize business to free ride on care work and require of it no obligation to replenish it. They entrench a deep-seated social tendency to social reproductive crisis, as well as a gender order that subordinates women. So that's our first precondition, non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy. A second precondition is ecological. Just as a capitalist economy depends on care work, so too it presupposes the availability of energy to power production, of material substrates, including those that we call raw materials, for labor to transform, and it presupposes as well sinks for absorbing production's waste. Capital relies, in short, on nature, in the sense first of specific substances inputted directly into production, and second of general environmental conditions, such as breathable air, potable water, fertile soil, relatively stable sea levels, and a habitable climate. But there again is the rub. By its very design, capitalist society incentivizes owners and investors to treat nature as a bottomless trove of non-economic treasure, which is there for the taking, infinitely self-regenerating, not needing replenishment or repair. All of those assumptions, of course, are completely false. As we've now finally come to realize, they are a recipe for disaster. Capitalist societies institutionalize a structural tendency to ecological crisis, as well as some very profound disparities in vulnerability to the ensuing fallout. Now, those disparities point to a third condition of possibility for capital accumulation, and that is wealth commandeered from subject populations. Almost always racialized, such populations are designated for expropriation as opposed to exploitation. They've been deprived of state protections and actionable rights, so their land and labor can be taken without remuneration and funneled into the circuits of accumulation. Now, expropriation has often been seen as an early superseded feature of a system that piles up wealth by exploiting free workers in factories, but that's a mistake. Capitalist production would not be profitable without an ongoing stream of cheap inputs, including natural resources and unfree or dependent labor, confiscated from populations who've been subjected through conquest, enslavement, unequal exchange, incarceration, or predatory debt, and are therefore unable to fight back. It's been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi, meaning that slave labor supplied the cheap raw cotton that fed the iconic textile mills at the dawn of industrialization. And that's absolutely true. But something really totally analogous is true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa. Cupertino is Apple's headquarters. Kinshasa is where lithium for Tesla's batteries and coltan for Apple's iPhones are mined on the cheap, at times by enslaved Congolese children. In truth, I'm suggesting capitalist society, even today, and overall, is necessarily imperialist, continuously creating defenseless populations for expropriation. Its economy doesn't work if everyone is paid wages that cover their true and full reproduction costs. It doesn't work, in other words, without a global color line dividing populations that are merely exploitable, whose reproduction costs are paid by capital, in theory at least, from those that are downright expropriable. By institutionalizing that division, capitalism also entrenches imperialism and racial oppression. Now, there is finally a fourth background condition for a capitalist economy, and that is public power. Paradigmatically, but not only, state power. Accumulation cannot proceed, after all, without legal systems that guarantee private property and contractual exchange, nor without repressive forces that manage dissent, put down rebellions, and enforce the status hierarchies that enable corporations to expropriate racialized populations at home and abroad. Nor can the system function without public regulations and public goods, including infrastructures of various kinds, nor without a stable money supply. All of these things are indispensable for accumulation and cannot be provided through the market, only via the exercise of public power. Capital needs such power then, but it is also primed to undermine it by evading taxes, weakening regulations, offshoring operations, and capturing public agencies. The result is a set of built-in tensions or contradictions between the imperatives of accumulation on the one hand and those of maintaining robust public power on the other. And that means the system entrenches a deep-seated tendency to precipitate political crises. On the one hand, crises of governance in which the system hollows out or destroys its own capacity to manage the problems it generates, and also crises of hegemony in which masses of people defect from politics as usual. Well, here then are four cases in which capital relies on background conditions that it is also primed to devour and hollow out. In general, and in all four cases, capitalist societies institute contradictory relations between their economies and the latter's non-economic conditions of possibility. The result is a tangle of crisis tendencies in multiple forms, which have now converged in a cannibal capitalist orgy. So let's look more closely at the present orgy, the present crisis, through the lens of COVID-19. Let's consider first nature, which, as I've just said, is the site of the system's ecological contradiction. I want to suggest, and it's not original at all to me, that it was none other than capital's cannibalization of nature that exposed humans to SARS-CoV-2 in the first place. Long harbored by bats in remote caves, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 made the zoonotic leap to us in 2019 by way of some as yet unidentified bridging species. One hypothesis early on was pangolins, but it's still not clear. What is clear, however, is what brought the bats into contact with that intermediary, and that intermediary in contact with us. And that was the combined effects of global warming on the one hand, and of tropical deforestation on the other hand. What's also crystal clear is that both of those processes, global warming and tropical deforestation, have been brought to us courtesy of capital, driven by its insatiable hunger for profit. Together, they, again, global warming, tropical deforestation, eviscerated the habitats of innumerable species, triggering mass migrations, creating new proximities among previously distant but now distressed organisms, promoting novel transfers of pathogens among them. That dynamic had already precipitated a string of viral epidemics: AIDS, Nipah, SARS, MERS, Ebola, now monkeypox, and COVID-19. More such pandemics generated through zoonotic transfers due to global warming and tropical deforestation are sure to come. They are the non-accidental byproducts of a social order that puts nature at the mercy of capital. Incentivized to appropriate biophysical wealth as quickly and cheaply as possible, with no responsibility for repair or replenishment, those dedicated to amassing profit decimate rainforests and bombard the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, hell-bent on accumulation in every era, but massively empowered now by neoliberalization. They let loose an escalating cascade of lethal plagues. Well, COVID's effects on humans would be horrific under any circumstances, but they have been made incalculably worse by another strand of the present crisis, rooted in another structural contradiction of capitalist society, one that has also been sharpened to a fever pitch in the neoliberal era. It is, after all, not just nature that capital has cannibalized in this period, but also public power. That, too, I've suggested, is an essential ingredient of its diet, avidly consumed in every phase of the system's development, but devoured with special ferocity in the last 40 years. And that's the catch. The political capacities that financialized capital has gorged on are precisely those we could have used to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. But well before the COVID outbreak, most states had already bowed to the demands of the markets, which is to say of large corporations, by slashing social spending, including in public health infrastructure and basic research. With a few exceptions, notably Cuba, they drew down stockpiles of life-saving equipment, they gutted diagnostic and tracing capacities, they shrank coordination and treatment capacities. Having eviscerated the public health infrastructure, moreover, our rulers devolved vital healthcare functions to profit-driven providers and insurers, to pharmaceuticals and manufacturers. These firms, which are constitutionally uninterested in and unconstrained by the public interest, now control the lion's share of the world's health-related resources, the labor forces and raw materials, the machinery and production facilities, the supply chains of intellectual property, the research institutions and personnel, in short, everything which determines our fates, individual and collective. Committed to preserving their profit streams at all costs, they now form a private force majeure that blocks concerted public action on behalf of humanity. The effects are tragic but unsurprising. A social system that subjects matters of life and death to the so-called law of value was structurally primed from the get-go to abandon untold millions to COVID-19. But that's not all. The collapse of already weak public systems converged with another structural contradiction of capitalist society, the one centered on social reproduction. Always a staple of capital's consumption, care work too has been voraciously gobbled up by it in recent years. The same regime that divested from public healthcare infrastructure also broke unions and drove down wages, compelling increased hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers. In other words, neoliberalism offloaded care work onto families and communities at just the moment when it commandeered the social energies we needed to perform it. And the effect was to turn capitalism's inherent tendency to destabilize social reproduction into an acute care crunch. COVID's advent intensified this strand of crisis too, dumping major new care chores onto families and communities, especially onto women who still do the lion's share of unpaid care work. Under lockdown, childcare and schooling shifted into people's homes, leading parents to take on that burden on top of others in confined domestic spaces, which of course were totally ill-suited to those purposes. Many employed women ended up quitting their jobs to care for kids and other relatives, while many others were laid off by employers. Both those groups have faced and still face major losses in position and pay if and when they rejoin the workforce. A third group, privileged to keep their jobs and work remotely from home, while also performing care work, including for housebound kids, had to take multitasking to new heights of craziness. A fourth group, not strictly delimited by gender, bore the honorific essential workers, but were paid a pittance and treated as disposable, required to brave the threat of infection daily, along with the fear of bringing it home, in order to produce and distribute the stuff that enabled others to shelter in place. In each of these cases, the work of social reproduction, now swollen by the pandemic, still fell and still falls largely to women, as it has in every phase of capitalism's history. But which women end up in which group depends on color and class. Structural racism, of course, infuses every aspect of the current crisis. At the global level, it colors the ecological strand as capital quenches its thirst for cheap nature, largely by seizing land, energy, and mineral wealth from racialized populations, whom, as I said, have been deprived of political protection and actionable rights. Having been subjected variously to conquest, enslavement, genocide, and dispossession by debt, those populations now bear an undue share of the global environmental load. Disproportionately vulnerable to toxic dumping, so-called natural disasters, and multiple lethal impacts of global warming, they now find themselves last in line for vaccines and therapeutics. At the national level, meanwhile, race, as we call it in the United States, inflects the political and social reproductive strands of the crisis, as communities of color are denied access to conditions that promote health. Affordable, high-quality medical care, clean water, nutritious food, safe working and living conditions, and so on. No wonder then that their members were disproportionately infected and killed by COVID. The reasons are not mysterious: poverty and inferior health care, pre-existing medical conditions linked to stress, poor nutrition, exposure to toxins, overrepresentation in frontline jobs that could not be performed remotely, lack of resources that would have permitted them to refuse unsafe work, and of labor rights that would have permitted them to win protections, inferior housing and living conditions that didn't allow for social distancing, that facilitated transmission, diminished access to vaccine and treatment. Together, those conditions expanded the meaning of the slogan, Black Lives Matter, synergizing with its original reference to police violence and helping to fuel ongoing protests. Color, moreover, is deeply entwined with class. I think what I've said already suggests that. That's true both in the capitalist world system generally and in the present period particularly. In fact, the two, color and class, overlap considerably, as that category essential worker shows. If we leave aside medical professionals, that designation, essential worker, covers migrant farm workers, immigrant meatpacking and slaughterhouse workers, Amazon warehouse pickers, UPS or other service delivery service drivers, nursing home aides, hospital cleaners, supermarket stockers and cashiers, gig workers who deliver groceries and take out meals. Especially dangerous in COVID times, these jobs are almost overwhelmingly low-paid, non-unionized, precarious, bereft of benefits and labor protections, subject to intrusive supervision and relentless speed up. Although others hold some of them too, they are disproportionately filled by women and people of color. Taken together, these jobs and those who perform them represent the face of the working class in financialized capitalism. No longer epitomized by the iconic figure of the white male factory worker, construction worker, miner, the working class today consists paradigmatically of care workers, gig workers, and low-wage service workers. They are paid less than the costs of their reproduction when they are paid at all. They are then expropriated as well as exploited. COVID exposed that dirty secret as well. By juxtaposing the essential character of that class's work to capital's systematic undervaluation of it, the pandemic has testified to another major contradiction of capitalist society, the inability of markets in labor power to accurately reckon the true worth of work. In general, then, COVID, I'm arguing, is a veritable orgy of capitalist irrationality and injustice. By ratcheting up the system's inherent defects to the breaking point, the pandemic shines a piercing beam on all of the structural contradictions of our society, dragging them out from the shadows and into the daylight. COVID has revealed capital's inherent drive to cannibalize nature up to the very brink of planetary conflagration. The system's drive to divert our capacities away from the truly essential work of social reproduction, its insatiable hunger to eviscerate public power to the point where it cannot solve the problems the system generates, its need to feed off the ever-decreasing wealth and health of racialized people, to not only exploit, but also expropriate the working class. In truth, we could not ask for a better lesson in social theory. But now comes the hard part, putting that lesson to work in political practice. It's time to figure out how to starve the beast and put an end once and for all to cannibal capitalism. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nancy. This is wonderful. The questions are lining up. let's wait a couple of seconds. We don't have much time. So I want everyone, interested audience who would like to address question, either in writing or we can give voice. So please write your questions. But while we're waiting, I would like to address one question where you left off. When you talk about, in your book, you describe neoliberalism as a cannibal capitalism on steroids. So when you, from the point you left off, how to starve the beast. So given your expanded conception of capitalism, one can say, and you also in the last chapter also say, we need an expanded conception of socialism. How could you walk us through your take on how socialism or anti-capitalism would look like in 21st century, especially if we want to starve the beast and just take out the last reserves of the steroids out of it?
That's a great question, Mina. Thanks for posing it. What I've sketched here, and in more detail in the book, is exactly this idea of an expanded view of capitalism, meaning that we have to look not only at the economy, but the relation to those four background conditions that I described. And what I've argued is that in every case, that relation is perverse, contradictory, and full of a tendency to precipitate crisis. It's a recipe for periodic crises, all of which have now converged, I think, at the present. So what I draw from that in terms of how to think about an alternative to capitalism, whether you call it socialism or something else, is that it's not enough, as the traditional socialist idea was, to talk about reorganizing production, socializing the ownership of the means of production, and so on and so forth. We also have to change, really deeply transform the relationship between production and reproduction, between whatever we're going to call the economic sphere in capitalism and politics or the organization of public power. We have to transform the relation of the economy and society more broadly to nature, and so on and so forth. So the job of creating an alternative is bigger than socialists and anti-capitalists have traditionally supposed. And I think we get a lot of insights into that from feminists who have tried to reimagine other ways of organizing social reproduction and its relation to production, from eco-Marxist, eco-feminist, eco-socialists who have tried to think about other ways of organizing our relationship to land and nature more broadly. And I think what we would need to do ultimately, and I can't claim to have done this, I think it's a job for all of us collectively, is to sort of reimagine a whole different institutional complex that would, the most pressing thing would be to dismantle those cannibalization tendencies. However we organize production, it can't be based on free riding and externalizing the costs of care, of political capacity, of nature, of designated groups of populations who are going to be, kind of devoured, essentially. One idea I had was that we should maybe think about the principle of pay as you go, that whatever external costs you generate have to be addressed. You can't defer them, dump them onto people elsewhere or onto future generations. That all of those costs have to be, to use the language of the economists, which I don't really like, but internalized, so to speak. And the one other point I would say is that then when we think about what kinds of political movements and struggles and organizing that we would need in order to really address the root causes of this crisis and to build a powerful, very broad coalition in support of an alternative, we would have to very much take an expanded view of what counts as anti-capitalist struggle, not just the struggle of workers at the point of production in industry and for profit, but also the struggles of people engaged in social reproduction work, in service work, in care work, paid or unpaid, in ecological sustenance activity, struggles over healthcare, over housing, over clean water, over climate. All of these are, in a sense, attacking points of capitalist irrationality and injustice. And we have to understand all of them as part of an anti-capitalist movement.
Thank you so much, Nancy. In order we can take the questions, Almira Mert, you can unmute yourself, please, and address your question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mine, and thank you, Professor. Thank you for the fantastic talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions. In your definition of cannibalism, you mentioned that your definition was the ritual of eating the human being by human being, and then you apply it to cannibal capitalism. You applied this definition to capitalist society. I was wondering if you had in mind, by transferring cannibalism to cannibal capitalism, also veganism and intersectionality of veganism with feminism, racism, and class struggle by your underlying of the ritual of eating the human being by human being. Is a ritual that happens, the murder of the human alive and alive and with a collective logistics. So did you have in mind intersectionalist veganism as well? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Very interesting question. I started with that definition, which, as I said, is the sort of most concrete one and the one that I think mainly, pops into mind. But I also added several more abstract definitions of cannibalism, including this idea of essentially siphoning resources from one enterprise in order to support another, which, suggests this idea of free riding on the background conditions, so to speak, using care as a resource for profit, just to be short with it. And the other one about the so-called astronomical one, which I thought was a good metaphor for imperialism. One mass is so powerful that by its gravitational attraction, it draws in others from peripheral zones. So I had a lot of things in mind with that. Now, in terms of eating animals, I am not starting out with the assumption that is always problematic. I am talking to you from a very mountainous, isolated area in rural Vermont, where people hunt to get protein. They are it's very regulated. They're very poor. It's very sustainable. So I don't myself do this or but I don't feel I'm in a position to say to very poor people that they shouldn't be doing this. They're not wasting anything from those animals, and the state carefully regulates that those animals can reproduce and so on. So I think I would distinguish between, factory farmed animals, and that is truly horrific. And in my view, that should simply be outlawed. Veganism, it's a healthy and a good way to live, I believe, but perhaps not the only healthy, good way to live. And I am not, this is one of those issues, and there are many. I would say the same thing about nuclear families. I don't start out with the idea that I know in advance that no one should live in nuclear families, that everyone should live in communes or in extended kin networks. I do know that whatever forms of living a just society develops, none of them can be premised on sexism or heterosexism or any form of an entrenched injustice. And I'm tempted to say something analogous about veganism or vegetarianism or pescatarianism and so on. I don't think we know now that there's only one way to eat in a future society. We certainly know that the way most people eat now is unhealthy for them, unhealthy for the ecosystem and the other creatures in it, and unjust as well as irrational. I think we can sort of figure out later, if we're lucky enough to get to this point, where we, as a society, as a world society, have to face these questions. I'm tending to try to distinguish where I think we're dealing with matters that are structurally unjust and structurally destructive, matters where I don't think I know enough to say.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Another thanks come from Duygun Ruben. She also asked, here I read the question, what are some of the causal relationships between your conception of cannibal capitalism and the rapidly deteriorating international relations and relations between power blocks and the risk of a great war today?
That's a very important and timely question, for sure. So in the book, I do have a chapter that deals with this question. I didn't hear. But I mean, look, there's a general problem, which is that capitalism, combines in one and the same world system a global economy and an international state system of multiple states. Now, that's already, even without saying yet anything more about the vast discrepancies in power among those states, the sort of imperial quality, even without saying that, you can see that there's already a tremendous mismatch between the political and the economic. We live in a world of, enormous, mega global corporations, many of whom, have a larger economic value, share value, so to speak, than the whole GDP of whole countries, including fairly sizable countries. So, and we don't have public powers that have the reach and the heft to govern those institutions, if indeed they could even be governed politically. So there's already, I think this is part of that built-in contradiction between the economic and the political, now looked at on this broader global or international scale. And part of what I said about imperialism being built into the system, that takes us back to the early days of the so-called discoveries of the New World, the conquests, and so on, and all the wars that generated. I don't just mean the wars of conquest and the decimation of indigenous peoples, but I mean the wars among the imperialist powers. Right, we already have, in the case of the big world wars of the 20th century, as well as several earlier ones, are inter-imperialist wars. Certainly, without getting into details now, I would try to make the case for that analysis, that the relevance of that kind of analysis to the present Russia-Ukraine war, in which Ukraine is obviously a proxy for the West. This is a war between Russia and the West, and being fought over the bodies of Ukrainians. And probably, contrary to perhaps what many of you think, I think that the United States has a huge share of the blame here. And we'd have to talk about what NATO is and why it was not disbanded after 1989 and so on and so forth. But so anyway, obviously energy politics and policy is fundamental. There's a large economic dimension here as well. Again, if you take the expanded view of capitalism, in which we take into account the political order that it generates, this imperialist multi-state political order, the struggle for hegemony among powerful states, whether the United States will continue as the sole superpower, as it at one point claimed that it wanted to be forever, where China is going to fit in as a very important rising power, where Russia will fit in as a declining power, et cetera, et cetera. This has everything to do with capitalism in this expanded sense.
Thank you so much, Nancy. As one of the chapter in your book indicates, and also this is an argument you develop also in other writings, but more explicitly in this recent book, you say, I quote, eco-politics must be trans-environmentalist and anti-capitalist. At this point, readers of the book and all of us audience have some idea of what anti-capitalism looks like in an expanded way, but can you also elaborate more on this trans-environmentalism and what you mean by it?
Yeah, thank you. This has to do with something that you, I think, mentioned in your introductory remarks, the problem of these single issue movements. What I meant by trans-environmentalism is forms of eco-politics that are very self-consciously premised on efforts to connect the dots between ecological devastation on the one hand and racial oppression on the other, the crisis of care and social reproduction, the crisis of democracy. These are, all the strands of that crisis. And my view is that none of them can be addressed in isolation from the others. They are interconnected. When you try to pull out one thing and, adopt a kind of monovision, a tunnel vision, and look only at that, what you end up doing is developing an approach that really is oriented to the most privileged people. Who looks at environmentalism as a sort of one-off single issue thing? Only people who don't have to worry about livelihood and livelihood security, or about being murdered on the streets by racist policemen, the US example, or who don't have to worry about childcare and so on and so forth. And historically, what we call environmentalism was, wilderness protection and so on. This was the environmentalism of the rich. And, there's that great book by Juan Martinez Allier called The Environmentalism of the Poor, which showed that there was always another environmentalism. And now we have movements oriented to environmental racism and so on. But what I'm saying about environmentalism, I would say about every other social movement, right? I co-authored a feminist manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, which made the same point. Single issue gender politics ends up being the feminism of the 1%. Single issue anti-racism, which Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has called the politics of getting Black faces into high places. These are highly, if you want, class-specific forms of anti-racism, anti-feminism, which are not what we need now. And given what I said before about the need for an expanded anti-capitalist movement, an expanded view of what an alternative is, that means that we really need to take what some people call intersectionality as a political impulse to a much, that needs to become much more central and important, that these struggles overlap, they interlock, they're interconnected. And when you take a narrow, truncated view of the stakes, you close off the possibility of alliances, you even set up conflicts of interest among people who need to find a way to ally themselves with each other. You create the impression that environmentalism is opposed to job security or income and livelihood security and so on and so forth. So that's what I meant to say when I used this phrase, trans-environmentalism.
Thank you so much, Nancy. One quick follow-up. Could you, when you write that there is a roiling dissensus beneath a superficial consensus on the climate change, on the science of the climate crisis, there's a scientific consensus, but rather in the realm of politics, there's a immense dissensus among the views and actors. The distinction, what would you think about the distinction and difference between like degrowth theories and the Green New Deal or the just transition arguments, specifically on the climate justice? Where do these paradigms fit in your framework?
Right. So I think if you look at this from one perspective, you see just a huge mass of competing views. But if you look at it from the perspective of what it means to create a kind of hegemonic eco-politics that could be trans-environmental and anti-capitalist, to go back to that, then I think the issue becomes, how do you simplify that field, that immense chaotic, right, mass of different ways of thinking? How do you simplify it and draw a clear line? And I would say that the clear line that I would like to see us figure out how to draw is the line between, say, green capitalism on the one side and all of these potentially anti-capitalist forces on the other side. And I think that degrowth, Green New Deal, just transition, environmental racism, I think all of those movements are on the potentially anti-capitalist side. And I say potentially because, there will be all sorts of attempts to co-opt strands of them. You can count on it by the green capitalist power structure, by the corporations and all of the politicians and so on that are linked to them. we could say I should mention ecofeminism too, right? There will be efforts to co-opt strands of them. What I'm hoping for is a clarification of that main fault line, right? Can we do this by proliferating markets in carbon offsets and emissions permissions? That's green capitalism. Or do we need, right, a much more fundamental transformation of the whole institutional structure of our form of life? Within that, you know, the differences between Green New Deal, degrowth, just transition, they have to be worked out in one way or another. But I think that for the main purposes of beginning to form this kind of counter-hegemonic eco-political and trans-environmental bloc, they're all on the same side, I would say.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Now, I think more questions. We are limited of time, but here I choose questions about the political crisis. One question from Demet Evrenasoğlu, also colleague from the New School as a postdoc politics. She has two questions, in fact. First one is, I read, how would you situate the backsliding of democracies to authoritarianism and the global rise of far right in relation to these different contradictions of capitalist society? First question. And the second one is, today, private property does not only cover the means of production, but also of social reproduction, often in the form of intellectual property rights and commodification. How should we critically rethink the notion of property and new imaginaries, maybe of social property, etc.? And she thanks, and we thank for the question.
Wonderful questions, and I'm very happy to hear from her and get these great questions. Yeah, so I do think that there's this sort of remarkable resurgence of, in some cases, proto-fascist, in other cases, right-wing populist movements, governments, political formations, and you know, a real deterioration in what we had thought of as democratic states. I have to say that these states were never really all that democratic to begin with for a lot of reasons, but okay, maybe they're even less so or becoming less so now. I think that lots of things are implicated in that. And maybe some of the kind of analysis I just did for COVID would apply as well to sort of analyzing this aspect of the crisis. I mean, one would be the sort of real deterioration in living standards of working classes, including some of those in the sort of historically more privileged sections of the working class, those who used to have relatively high-paying jobs in manufacturing unions and so on and so forth. So now the sort of the emergence of the Rust Belt in the historic core of capitalism, where I'm sitting, really created enormous levels not just of economic insecurity and worsened conditions, including massive opioid addiction, gun violence, suicide, and so on, which mark some of these communities that were once, you know, considered privileged working class centers. But it also stoked, you know, horrific paranoid forms of scapegoating. And then you get the rise of demagogic, the opposite, demagogic leaders, strongmen figures who fan those scapegoating tropes and memes. And in these far right white supremacist, in some cases anti-Muslim and so on and so forth movements. And that's all also relates to this question of the hollowing out of public power. Now, I spoke too quickly about that because what I didn't do was to really explain that the forms of public power that are hollowed out are the regulatory capacities against corporations and the social infrastructure, the public provisions that working class people have depended upon, as opposed to the police, the armies, the repressive forces are not being hollowed out in many places. And so as the capacities for actually addressing people's problems declines, right, then you get more and more of a sense that that the government is working for somebody else. It's not working for me. And then again, the strong man becomes the figure. I'm going to only I can save you, as Trump famously said at one point. So anyway, again, I think the real deterioration in living conditions due to financialization, due to global warming, due to all the deterioration of public infrastructure, disinvestment in social provision, all of that, but now marked with these paranoid scapegoating tropes. I mean, part of what that says to me is the absence of a left counter narrative that not only gives an alternative explanation for the deterioration of living conditions, but that also validates those grievances and directs them to an alternative diagnosis and an alternative sense of who are your allies. The very people that are now stigmatized are the allies you need to fight the true causes. This is the way the left talked always in earlier periods, more or less successfully, not always successful, but we need to hear a lot more of that right now. And that means trying to woo some of those forces that are now gravitating to the extreme right, not simply to write them off. Some of them are hopeless and can be written off, but not all. So anyway, that's how I understand that as part of this crisis of hegemony, so to speak, that strand of the crisis. Now you ask about the property question, and yes, I think that that these questions about that we need to be talking not only about private property and the means of production, but about all this whole sphere of financialization, right? In which there's tremendous property rights in paper assets that are built layer upon layer through so-called securitization or derivatives construction, including environmental derivatives, by the way. So there's that aspect that it's controlling the mass of that is, in a sense, you could say, diverting attention from and diverting investment from actually producing use values, what people need. We are not producing what people need. What is being produced are new financial instruments. And that's where a lot of creativity and so on goes. And then with that goes, as you rightly mentioned, intellectual property rights. And as I was trying to suggest in discussing COVID, the privatization of healthcare resources, but we could also many other kinds of resources too. So much of this takes the form of intellectual property rights, which are function, again, as cannibalizing mechanisms of wealth drain that drains real wealth from populations, you know, I mean, I could go on and on about this because I mean, here in the United States, where you know, the Moderna, so-called Moderna vaccine was really developed with the National Institutes of Health, with public funds and public research capacity and decades of work. And we now have Moderna filing a patent on its own for that vaccine. So now that is a perfect example of a new enclosure. You had a commons, an intellectual commons that's now being enclosed in the form of a private property right on which people will have to pay royalties to access. So these are these questions of property. Whereas, of course, you're absolutely right that all of these what are sometimes considered to be the great marvels that capitalism produces, like medical knowledge and so on, these are actually collective products, right? That involve, you know, centuries of people learning how to do things without ever feeling the need to smack a patent on it and say it's mine exclusively. And so one clear thing that we do have to do is develop a complete new system that validates collective property, commons ownership, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much. Last two questions. One from one of them is also about the knowledge production. And our colleague from Boğaziçi University, Aslı Küçük from the faculty strike, asked about how does Cannibal Capitalism, this insatiable beast, tackle knowledge as it's disseminated in colleges around the world? Where do you see the universities and colleges in this picture? Is this also not a way of stealing from the future for the sake of immediate gain? Like, can you elaborate more on this knowledge production and the role of institutions in this picture?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, one thing has to do with privatization of universities themselves. I mean, this has always been a strong element of U.S. higher education. Has been these private universities that have very, very astronomically high tuition, that are basically universities for the rich, that you know, turn out students who are already networked, and you know, half of the Harvard grads go right to Wall Street and so on and so forth. So that's familiar to us, but in many other countries that have had a strong tradition of public higher education, this is now being challenged in part by the imposition of high fees and tuition in education that used to be free or very low cost, and by the formation of many new private universities. Then there's also the corporate funding of research, which usually comes with a lot of strings. So if a pharmaceutical company is funding research, there may be, they may have the right, according to the contracts through which the funding is secured, to suppress research findings that show that their drugs are not really working. So there are lots of constraints over, you know, who owns the research and can it even be made public? And of course, publication of research results is an absolutely central mechanism of knowledge production, of the knowledge commons. That's being infringed on. And the funding of research chairs in certain areas by bodies with an interest in a certain point of view, who may even have a fair amount of say over who gets hired in the position that they're funding. We've seen all kinds of interference of that kind in faculties who want to produce scholars working on what is now derogatorily called critical race theory. being, blocked by funders who don't want to fund that. Finally, student debt. I don't know how big this is in Turkey, but it's astronomical in many countries, including the US is the poster child for this. Forget about graduate education, but even undergraduate education, people graduate owing, a couple of $100,000. So the whole trajectory of their lives is constrained by this. They have to take high-paying jobs when they graduate. They can't work in the fields that they are interested in that involve some kind of public service because they won't be able to repay the loans. They have to live with their parents forever because they can't ever get an apartment on their own, and so on and so forth. That's enormous. And I think one thing I want to say about graduate education, and Mina knows about this, having done her PhD at the New School for Social Research. We are the most contradictory university institution imaginable. We advertise ourselves, and to some degree with some truth, as a kind of offering a critical education. We specialize in paradigms of knowledge that are counter to the powers that be in the world, and yet, in terms of how we actually operate on the political economic level, we are a completely neoliberal institution. We teach anti-neoliberalism, but we treat our students and our adjunct faculty and so on in a perfectly neoliberal wealth extracting form. So, there's, what can I say? I feel like I'm living in this contradiction day in and day out.
Thank you so much, Nancy. One last question is a combined one. In your book, and also in your presentation, in your talk, neoliberalism is taken as an advanced, like financialized, crisis-prone, and an advanced contemporary state of capitalism. But the neoliberalism also can be named as a perspective, as a zeitgeist that shapes our subjectivities, desire, irrationalities, or the drives that determines our affects, experience, how we understand and give meaning to the irrationalities we're living. So talking about a way out of this cannibalistic system and society, how would we transform or imagine an alternative life worlds and collective belonging and identities and struggles, given the long history of our subjectivities are deeply ingrained with this irrational and survivalistic drive to for competition or for just living the day off on the backs of other people. And also a follow-up question, kind of related one. One of our colleagues asked about the power of conspiracy theories that COVID-19 pandemic revealed. And she says, I quote, how easy people tend to follow these imaginations and irrationality, which is somehow rooted in their perception of the world. It disheartens many of us because of these falsehoods were able to motivate people and make them act more than we environmentalists or feminists could have done so far. This was highly disheartening, Tuba says, and it seems that our task even now harder than before. Do you have any suggestion for this problem? Because this question is not only showing us that capitalism is cannibalistic, but also making it difficult for people to see it. This is the kind of the ideology of the ideological power of the cannibalistic capitalism. So how would you elaborate on that?
Great. Okay. So the ideological, this is good. Let's distinguish I think it's already implicit, but let me spell this out, that we have to distinguish when we talk about neoliberalism, we're often using these terms in very different ways at different levels. So we need to distinguish a neoliberal phase of capitalism according to the structures by which economy and polity are related, production and reproduction are related, society, nature are related. And we would look at importantly at how the dismantling of the Bretton Woods international architecture changed the relations between states and corporations and so on. This is all very objective and very structural. Then we would have to talk about neoliberal policies that states adopt within that larger framework, like divesting from social spending and investing instead in various forms of corporate giveaways and so on. In part, again, under the impetus of corporate pressure and market pressures by the investor classes. Then we'd have to talk about neoliberal ideologies. And I would say here we're talking about things like the idea, so-called free market fundamentalism trickle down, the idea that states are very sort of, gross and crude ways of managing things, state power. Markets are supple and lean, and we can do much more through the market than we can through the public sector. And then the last thing is which I think the first questioner was getting at, had to do with this question of subject formation. And, there's a lot of interesting descriptions that come out of often either out of the human capital theory or out of Foucauldian governmentality theory, which has to do with, we're interpolated as utility maximizing managers of our own human capital and so on and so forth. And as if neoliberalism, not just at the level of these beliefs about the market, but the actual sort of grammar of our psychologies is changing. Now, I want to say that all three levels all four levels of this are useful, but I think that the reach of the last one has been vastly overestimated by some analysts. I think that in the professional managerial classes, that account makes some sense. I mean, these people really do, think that in paying in New York $20,000 to send them to a 5-year-old to the right nursery school, that they're investing so that eventually that kid is going to get into Harvard and so on and so forth. That is a human capital kind of approach. But among poor and working class people, rural people, peasants, and so on, I don't believe that this kind of thinking is widespread. Or if it is among peasants, it's a much older thing. It's not neoliberal. It's, you maybe have more kids because you need more hands on the plot of land or whatever. So my idea is, and I've always had this problem with Foucault. I think capitalist societies have a lot of internal differentiation and complexities. I think there are different normative grammars, different social ontologies that coexist in a lot of tension because they're contradictory to each other, but that coexist. We operate with one mindset in one arena of life, with another mindset in another arena of life. And part of what I tried to do in the book is articulate these different grammars of normativity and of sociality. I think to say that one of these that would be the sort of economistic human capital one is determinative for everybody all the time is a mistake. And that's the answer to my to your question about how can we how can we organize against this? It's because we are not purely neoliberal subjects. It's because we are complicated subjects, that we have at our disposal a multiplicity of grammars for claims making and for interpreting our situations and for acting. And it's by mobilizing some of the alternative grammars against that one. I think of it as being sort of bad subjects by taking grammars that might apply in community life and trying to apply them in economic life, that you know, we create useful friction, useful trouble. Conspiracy theories, in my view, most of these are not neoliberal. They're anti-neoliberal. They are right-wing authoritarian populists. They're not about that market ideology. So that's yet something else. And that, as I tried to suggest before, has something to do with this paranoia that arises out of a mix of real deterioration in life, in the life world, and you know, imagined scapegoating that is not real, and it's sort of separating the two. That's the problem. How to separate those two, because they're all mixed up together now. Okay.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's been a great pleasure, and I apologize from the audience. There's a great bombardment of questions and comments. Everyone is thankful. So far, no question or no comment, such as nasty or like nothing bad. But so we would like to thank you once again for this wonderful and like mind-opening talk, and for your presence with us. Next time, hopefully, would love to see you and discuss all about this, hopefully in a COVID-free world in Istanbul with us in person. Thank you so much once again. Have a good evening, everyone, and have a great rest of the day, Nancy, in the other part of the world. And we send our warm regards. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. Thanks to everyone. Great discussion.
Bye-bye.